At 3 a.m, my phone rang. My father's voice came through, calm, cold. "Your apartment's on fire. Hope you had insurance." I laughed, not from shock, not relief, but because that was the first time he'd spoken to me in 12 years. Not to say he missed me, not to ask if I was safe, just property talk. They burned me long before the flames did. I'm Grace Walker, and this is the story of how I survived my parents' silence, a fire that wasn't an accident, and how the ashes gave me the voice they tried to bury. The gallery was silent, the kind of silence only found in the early hours when even the city that never sleeps finally takes a breath. Grace Walker lay curled on the faux leather couch in the gallery's back office, a paint-streaked blanket thrown haphazardly over her. Her body ached from bending over canvases for 12 hours straight, but exhaustion had numbed the pain. The smell of varnish still lingered in the air, mixing with that faint metallic scent old buildings carried, like history hanging in the vents. She had fallen asleep sometime after midnight, still wearing her studio clothes. Her palms were smudged with dried charcoal, and one of her boots was halfway off. This gallery, though small, felt more like home than the apartment she'd rented for 5 years. Here, at least, no one had told her she was wasting her life. No one measured her worth in spreadsheets. Then the phone rang. 3 a.m. Her hand fumbled on the floor, knocking over an empty water bottle before finding the phone. The screen glared back at her. Dad. That name still existed in her contacts, not out of sentiment, but out of logistics. There was no photo attached, just the cold black and white of her default screen. She answered with a hoarse voice. "Hello?" "Grace," came the voice. Low, unshaken, unchanged. Her stomach twisted. 12 years of silence, and now this. "Your apartment building is on fire," he said. No greeting, no preamble. "Just saw it on the news. Hope you had insurance." There was a pause, long, wide, heavy. Then she laughed. It wasn't a small laugh, not a chuckle. It was something raw, something absurd. The kind of laugh that came from realizing you were being crushed by a piano and all you could do was watch. Why are you laughing?" he asked, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly. Grace swallowed the sound in her throat, still breathless. "Because, Dad, of course that's what you'd say." "I don't understand." "No," she said quietly, "you wouldn't." The call stretched. Grace could hear a muffled television in the background, probably the news report about her building, her life going up in smoke. "You're not in the building, are you?" he finally asked, tension climbing now. "No, I'm not." Her voice was flat. Relief exhaled from his end, like an untied balloon. "Thank God. But you're about to lose everything, Grace. You should have listened to me. I told you to get insurance." There it was again. That tone. Practical, clinical, as if the past didn't exist, as if he hadn't disowned her at 25 for choosing paintbrushes over profit margins. "I'll call you later," she said, and hung up. She stared at the phone in her hand. No missed calls, no messages. For 12 years, not a word. And now? Now he calls because her apartment was burning, not to check if she was okay, but to confirm whether she had made smart choices. She stood slowly, stretching limbs that felt heavier with each heartbeat. She grabbed her coat from the peg by the gallery door, glanced once at the canvases she had finished hanging just hours ago. A lifetime of emotion trapped in wood and paint. They were safe, miraculously. Because tonight, of all nights, she had stayed late and slept on a couch under fluorescent lights and acrylic fumes. It was unplanned, unintended, and it had saved everything that still mattered. As she stepped out into the Brooklyn night, the sirens already echoed faintly in the distance. Grace walked briskly down the dark Brooklyn street, cold wind biting at her cheeks as sirens screamed louder with every block. But her mind wasn't on the fire anymore. It was somewhere else, someone else. Her past had come rushing back the moment she heard her father's voice. That voice had once ruled her life like a judge with no appeal. Her father, Richard Walker, had built his reputation brick by brick as a ruthless CEO of a finance firm. Precision, planning and predictability were his commandments. He believed in numbers, not emotions. Efficiency, not dreams. Her mother, Eleanor, was no gentler. A private school English teacher with a strict sense of decorum, she believed rebellion was an illness. She wore pearls at breakfast and spoke in full sentences even when angry. Their house was immaculate, their schedule airtight. Grace was raised like a resume in the making: piano at 6, tennis at 9, debate team at 11. Her sketchbooks were hidden beneath her mattress, the only place she could be messy. Art wasn't encouraged, it wasn't even acknowledged. When her father found a charcoal drawing of hers at age 16, he stared at it like it was graffiti on a white wall. Nice hobby, he had said, before tossing it into the trash. Still, Grace clung to her secret life, doodling on the back of financial statements, sketching faces during dinner conversations she wasn't invited to join. Her dream to attend art school was met with thin smiles and immediate rejection. "We've invested too much in your future to let you throw it away," her mother had said, flatly. College became a negotiation. Business major, minor in art, compromise masked as choice. She complied, she always complied, until she didn't. At 25, after years of following a path laid out for someone else, she walked into the dining room during a quarterly family dinner, portfolio in hand, and declared she was leaving the firm to pursue art full-time. The silence was instant, heavy, like someone had pulled the plug on the air in the room. Her father had stared at her over his glasses. "If you walk out that door, Grace, don't expect it to open again." She remembered smiling through the tears. "Good," she had said, turning the handle, "because I don't want to come back to a place that was never open to me anyway." She had left with 2 suitcases and $312 in her bank account. Her parents didn't call, didn't write, no birthday texts, no holiday cards for 12 years. 12. And now, at 3 a.m, her phone finally rang, and it was about fire insurance. Not, "Are you alive?" Not, "We miss you." Just concern for policies and premiums. Grace's stomach tightened as she arrived at the barricades. The sky above her building glowed orange, reflected in the glass of nearby windows like an inferno in a snow globe. Her breath caught as she stared at what used to be home. This wasn't grief, it wasn't even shock. It was something more surgical, something colder. Of course, this was how they came back into her life, not with love, not with regret, but with logistics, asset loss. She stepped closer, the scent of smoke wrapping around her like a second skin. She looked up at the flames licking the night sky and whispered under her breath, "Guess this is what it took to get your attention." And still she knew they hadn't really called for her. They called for the idea of her, the daughter they had once shaped, the plan they thought they'd lost control of, a number on a balance sheet, a name in a burned-out lease. This wasn't reunion. It was arithmetic. The closer Grace got to the building, the more the smoke thickened, not just in the air but in her chest. Every step felt like a journey back into a life she had barely managed to build. The sidewalks were wet, reflecting red and blue lights from fire trucks, emergency vehicles and news vans that formed a chaotic ring around her former home. Police tape fluttered in the cold breeze like mocking ribbons. She hadn't cried, not once, even as she pushed past the crowd, even as she saw blackened windows where sunlight once streamed in on her canvases. Her heart didn't break, it recoiled, and something about that frightened her more than flames. A fireman stopped her at the barricade. "You can't go past this point, ma'am." "My apartment was in there," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Unit 4B. I need to know if anyone—" The man looked at her face and softened. "You're a tenant?" She nodded. "Everyone got out," he said quickly. "There are a few people over there with the Red Cross. If you recognise anyone, you might want to check in." Grace's eyes followed his gesture and locked onto a makeshift triage area under a school awning. Dozens of people wrapped in thin emergency blankets sat on plastic folding chairs, some with soot-smudged cheeks, others just staring at nothing. Familiar faces emerged from the blur, people who had been her neighbours for years, people she had never called family, but who had filled that space far better than the ones who shared her blood. She spotted Miss Cho first, the elderly woman from 2A who always left dumplings at Grace's door during Lunar New Year. Then there was Armando and Julia, the couple from 5D who threw building-wide potlucks in the summer. Walter, the retired jazz teacher from 6C, sat with his saxophone case on his lap, even though she doubted he'd had time to grab anything else. "Grace?" someone called. She turned and saw Tasha from 3F, her face pale and hair still damp from whatever water had been sprayed inside. "Oh my God, girl, thank God you weren't in there." Grace moved without thinking, wrapping her in a hug. The human contact broke something loose inside her. Her body finally acknowledged the fear her mind had been ignoring. "Is everyone safe?" she asked. "Mostly. A couple people went to the hospital for smoke inhalation. Some pets didn't make it." Tasha's voice caught, but she forced herself to smile. "But we're alive." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Have they said what started it?" "Something electrical, they think," said Walter, who had walked over despite his slight limp. "Started on the 3rd floor, near the utility room. Weird thing, though. Everything above and below got hit hard, but that floor barely touched. That doesn't make sense," Grace said. "Wouldn't the floor where it started be the worst?" "That's what I thought too," Walter said grimly. "Guess the fire had manners," Tasha added with a hollow laugh. Grace looked back at the building. From the outside, the damage was uneven, almost surgical. Floors 2 and 4 were blackened, windows shattered, bricks scorched. But the 3rd floor, the lights were off, but the windows weren't broken. No char marks. "Do you know exactly where it started?" she asked. "In or near the electrical room," Walter replied. "Far end of the hall, near the stairwell." Grace's breath caught. That room had always been locked. Even tenants didn't have access. It was where the building's old electrical infrastructure had lived for decades, the source of countless complaints and quick fixes. "Did anyone see anything?" she asked. Tasha shrugged. "I was out. Overnight shift. Came home to this." Her eyes welled up. "My cat, Grace. I'm so sorry." Another firefighter passed, and Grace caught his arm. "Do you know the exact cause?" He hesitated. Too early to say for sure, but the structure's unstable, probably outdated wiring. It happens. It happens. That phrase dug into her. It happens. As if that explained anything. As if systems just randomly decided to self-destruct. A news reporter was nearby, talking into a camera while gesturing to the scorched building behind her. Grace's name hadn't been mentioned yet. But the camera sweep caught the faces of her neighbours, their eyes hollow and dazed. "Are they going to let us back in?" someone asked the Red Cross volunteer. "Not tonight," she said gently. "Maybe not for days, maybe longer." Grace turned back to the gallery down the street. Her paintings were still hanging there, untouched. Her brushes, her journals, her tools. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, but her art, her identity, had been saved by sheer accident. No, not accident. Instinct. Somewhere deep inside she had known not to go home. And that thought chilled her more than the wind. The next morning, Grace returned to what was left of the building with a small group of tenants allowed brief, escorted access. The air still carried the sharp bite of smoke and soaked drywall. A firefighter handed her gloves and a mask before letting her pass the barricade. Inside, the stairs groaned underfoot. She climbed slowly to the 4th floor, heart pounding not from fear, but from an eerie sense of anticipation. Her apartment door had been kicked in during the rescue. The hinges dangled like broken limbs, and the hallway was littered with soggy debris. Inside, the damage was uneven. Water pooled across the warped hardwood floors. Her couch was bloated, sagging under the weight of soaked cushions. Books had turned into pulp. But the walls, at least the ones still standing, bore the scars of smoke, not flame. She crouched near the bedroom closet, retrieving the small fireproof box she had stored under a loose floorboard. Inside were her passport, some old family photos and a few letters, most unopened. She clutched the contents tightly and returned to the gallery, needing space to breathe and think. That afternoon, as Grace joined some neighbours at a local coffee shop, the tone of the conversation shifted. Vanessa from the 2nd floor leaned over her latte and said, "You know Mr. Reynolds sold the building, right?" Grace blinked. "What? When?" "About 3 months ago," Vanessa said. "I heard it from my cousin. She works in property records. Why didn't anyone tell us? That's the thing, Vanessa lowered her voice. He didn't. No one got formal notice, but the sale's on record. The new owners, a development group called Ironstone Partners. Grace's heart skipped. She had heard of Ironstone before, through headlines and whispers in artist circles. They were known not just for buying up old buildings in gentrifying neighbourhoods, but for what happened shortly afterward. Fires, structural damage, sudden evictions, always followed by slick new condos priced 10 times higher. You think they had something to do with this? Grace asked slowly. I don't know, Vanessa said, but I do know that utility room on 3A. My husband says he saw unfamiliar men in suits going in and out 2 days before the fire, said they didn't look like city inspectors. The third floor, the one that barely burned, Grace felt a cold thread run through her spine. Later that evening, back at the gallery, Grace sat on the floor, surrounded by the soggy contents of her fireproof box. Most things were salvageable. She thumbed through documents she hadn't touched in years, but one envelope made her pause. It was marked only with her name in neat cursive, her mother's handwriting. There was no return address. The postmark dated back 7 years. She had never opened it. Grace remembered finding it in the mailbox of her first Brooklyn apartment. It had come during one of her hardest months when rent was overdue and gallery rejections piled high. She hadn't been ready to read it then. She wasn't sure she was ready now. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside a single page, her mother's voice poured out in careful ink. Grace, I don't know if you'll ever open this, or if you'll even believe I wrote it without your father knowing. I just wanted you to know that I think of you, that I keep every photo of your artwork I can find online, even when he tells me not to. I don't agree with how things happened. I wish I had spoken louder. I wish I had stopped him, but I didn't, and I'm sorry. That was it. No apology for the years of silence, no contact number, no promise of change, just guilt, thinly veiled as affection. It left a bitter taste in her mouth. She set the letter down beside a singed photo of her childhood birthday. 7 candles, 4 smiles, untouched cake. This wasn't just a fire. This wasn't just bad wiring. It was something older, deeper. A rot that had started long before the building burned. Grace found Leo Martinez through a mutual contact, Sophia, the gallery owner. Leo was a rising investigative reporter with a reputation for exposing shady developers in the outer boroughs. His writing was sharp, relentless, and unpopular among the wealthy, which of course made him exactly the kind of person Grace needed. They met in the back corner of a bookstore cafe, surrounded by the scent of old paper and strong espresso. Leo arrived with a messenger bag stuffed with manila folders, a recording pen, and a notepad already covered in notes. Ironstone, huh? He said after she filled him in. Yeah, that name's been floating around for a while. Fires. Unforeseen structural issues. Sudden permits approved. Tenants pushed out. Condos go up. Rinse, repeat. Grace leaned forward. You think this wasn't an accident? I'd bet my press badge on it, Leo said. But proving it, that's another story. They started digging. Leo showed her his database, a timeline of suspicious fires across the city over the past 5 years. Red dots covered the map. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx. When filtered for properties recently acquired by Ironstone or any of its shell companies, 4 dots remained. All 4 buildings were over 40 years old, low income, and had long-term tenants, Leo explained. Each one had incidents within months of being purchased: fires, pipe bursts, gas leaks, afterward demolition, then high-rise luxury builds. Grace felt a knot in her throat. And no one's been held accountable? Not yet, Leo replied. The company's got layers. Paperwork loops through 3 LLCs before you find anything even remotely traceable. By then it's buried. Still, Grace couldn't let it go. She remembered the men Vanessa had mentioned, strangers in suits, walking through her building days before the fire. She thought about the untouched utility room, the 3rd floor that didn't burn. It felt orchestrated, like someone had struck just the right match. The more they uncovered, the more she pushed. She contacted old friends, former neighbours, even her ex from years back who once worked in city planning. Most offered sympathy, few offered help. Desperate, she reached out to Claire Jensen. someone she hadn't spoken to since college. Back then, Claire had been the one who helped her cram for finals, who'd kept Grace grounded when everything felt like it was spiralling. Now Claire was a real estate attorney working for a mid-sized firm in Manhattan. They met for lunch in Midtown. Grace wore clothes borrowed from Sophia. Claire arrived in a tailored navy suit and a tight bun, looking like she belonged in a courtroom or a corporate merger. "So," Claire said over grilled salmon, "you think the fire was intentional?" "I know it sounds crazy, but no, I didn't say it sounds crazy," Claire interrupted gently. "Just difficult to prove." Grace explained everything. The pattern Leo had found, the whispers, the letter from her mother, the new ownership. Claire listened carefully. When Grace finished, there was a pause. "I'm sorry, Grace," Claire said. "I really am, but I can't help you." Grace blinked. "What? Why?" Claire looked away. "My firm has a client, one of Ironstone's parent companies. I'd have to recuse myself from anything even resembling this." "Claire, you always said if I needed help. I meant emotionally. Legally, this could end my career." Grace stared at her, the words slicing deeper than she expected. She felt the old wound reopening, people choosing safety over truth, reputation over justice. "I understand," she said coldly. "Thanks for the lunch." They didn't hug goodbye. Back at the gallery, Grace relayed everything to Leo. He didn't look surprised. "Corporate law's a maze," he said. "People go in with a compass and leave without their spine." Grace stared out the window. "So we're on our own?" Leo shook his head. "Not entirely. We've got the truth. That's more than most." But even truth, she realised, could be a lonely thing. The tension didn't creep in all at once. It dripped like a leaky pipe, unnoticed, until the water hit her ankles. First, it was the man she saw twice on her walk from the subway. Same coat, same limp, always turning away just as she looked up. Then it was the buzz on her phone. Unknown numbers calling, hanging up before she answered. Sometimes no ring at all, just a voicemail filled with static. At first, Grace chalked it up to paranoia. Trauma did that, right? Made shadows look like threats. But then she returned to her temporary sublet. An old artist friend had offered her the space for a month and noticed something off. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched. The coffee mug she always left in the sink had been rinsed and moved to the drying rack. A framed print she hadn't straightened yet now hung perfectly level. Her drawers, while closed, felt too tight, as if someone had opened them all and shoved them shut too quickly. It wasn't a robbery, it was a message. She sat down, hands trembling, scanning the room like it might confess to her. Then she checked the fireproof box she had moved from the gallery to the sublet, a place she thought safe. All the contents remained, the passport, the photos, the letter from her mother, and one more thing, a thin beige folder unmarked. She hadn't put it there. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside were photocopied pages from a psychiatric evaluation. The first few lines confirmed the subject. Grace Walker, female, 25, referred for assessment by family. She blinked. The report was dated shortly after her departure from home. The pages described her as emotionally volatile, disorganised in thought, prone to impulsive behaviour, and exhibiting grandiose, unrealistic beliefs about career success, despite poor evidence of practical planning. Her stomach flipped. There were sections highlighted. Subject exhibits patterns consistent with moderate personality instability. Recommendations include continued monitoring and possible consideration of legal protective oversight. At the bottom of the last page, a note scribbled in blue ink. Assessment provided for consideration in establishing limited legal guardianship if voluntary treatment is refused. Grace's hands shook. They had tried to declare her mentally unfit, not just disown her, not just cut ties. They had considered taking away her legal agency, stripping her of adult status, making her decisions theirs again. The same people who hadn't called her in 12 years had, at some point, considered declaring her incompetent. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the flood of memory. The fights, the accusations, the moment her father slammed the door behind her and said, "If you walk out of everything." She had believed he meant financial support, emotional access, not legal autonomy. She reread the documents twice, hunting for any mention of resolution. There was none. No follow-up evaluation. No court action, at least not in these pages. Had they gone through with it and failed, or had this just been a weapon they considered, shelved for later? The idea that they'd even drafted this was enough. It reframed everything. The silence hadn't been punishment, it had been strategy, and now that she was stirring up trouble, uncovering corporate ties, threatening reputations, they were watching, nudging, reminding her that they could still ruin her if they wanted. The fire hadn't destroyed her, so maybe they'd try something quieter. Grace sat motionless for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she planned. The next day she scanned and uploaded every page of the file to an encrypted drive. She gave copies to Leo and Sophia. She contacted a friend in cybersecurity and asked for help securing her devices. Then she packed what little she had and moved again, this time to a spare studio above the gallery, a place with only one way in and multiple cameras installed. She didn't know how much more of this she could take, but she knew one thing. They were afraid, and people only try to silence those who are getting too close to something dangerous. It was raining when Grace saw him again. Her father, standing under the gallery's overhang in a grey overcoat, holding nothing but an umbrella and the kind of presence that always filled the room before he even stepped inside. Richard Walker, once the untouchable king of numbers and control, looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she had grown. She didn't say anything, just stared at him through the glass door. He gave a hesitant wave. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. "Grace," he said softly, "can we talk?" Her first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but something in his eyes stopped her. Not arrogance, not condescension. Something she couldn't name. She nodded slowly and stepped aside. They walked through the gallery in silence. Her paintings lined the walls, torn cityscapes, shadows of buildings, blurred faces in dark alleys. She watched his eyes scan the work, unsure if he understood it, or if he was even trying. He turned to her. "You did this?" She nodded. "It's intense." "Yeah," she replied, "so was being abandoned." He flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he sat on the worn leather couch near the far wall, the same one she had slept on the night of the fire. "I know I don't deserve a warm welcome," he said, "but I heard about the break-in, and other things." You mean the fire? Or the files you probably helped deliver to my apartment?" He raised both hands. "I had nothing to do with that." "Then why are you here?" he sighed. "Because I'm worried about you, Grace, truly. I know I've made mistakes. I thought I was doing the right thing when I pushed you to be practical. But maybe I was just afraid of how unpredictable the world is, of how easily it can swallow someone like you." She folded her arms. "You didn't just push me. You tried to erase me." "I didn't..." He stopped, catching himself. "Maybe I did, but I'm here now." "And that's supposed to be enough?" "No," he admitted, "but maybe it's a start." Despite herself, a part of Grace softened. It was the most honest thing she had heard from him in years. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a diner around the corner, still open. Could I buy you dinner?" She hesitated, then nodded once. The place hadn't changed. Still smelled like grease and coffee and cracked vinyl booths. They ordered simple meals, no wine, no distractions, just food and awkward conversation about the weather, the art world, the state of New York City housing. For a few minutes it almost felt like a version of normal. Then dessert came, and with it a manila envelope. He slid it across the table. "What's this?" Grace asked, not touching it. "An agreement," he said calmly. "If you sign it, you'll receive $200,000, tax-free, and a condo uptown. It's already paid off." Her pulse slowed, then spiked. She stared at him, numb. "In exchange for what?" she asked. "Letting go, dropping your investigation, walking away from this vendetta. It's not safe, and it's not your fight." Her mouth went dry. "Not my fight? You're putting yourself at risk, making enemies you can't see. I just want you to have a fresh start, secure, comfortable." She pushed the envelope back across the table. "You really think this is about comfort?" "I think it's about peace," he said, voice steady. Grace stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You don't want peace. You want silence." Grace left the diner without another word. She didn't look back, didn't wait to hear her father call after her. The rain had stopped, but the cold bit through her coat like betrayal through skin. Her footsteps echoed against the pavement, each one a beat in the drum of rejection. Again. How many times could a person be discarded by the same people before the damage became permanent? She wasn't angry, not in the fiery, shouting way. She was hollowed out, gutted. Because that envelope hadn't come from a place of care. It was a bribe, a silence payment. He'd flown across the country not to reconnect, not to make amends, but to shut her down, like a liability, again. Back at the gallery, she sat alone in the dark. The soft hum of the fridge was the only sound. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the folder she'd kept. The psychiatric report, the letter from her mother, the growing pile of paper that painted a picture far more vivid than any canvas could. But there was still something missing, a reason. Why now? Why the sudden attempt to protect her after all these years? She opened her laptop and dove into the online corporate records she and Leo had been combing through for weeks. Her father's name wasn't anywhere on Ironstone's executive board. No press releases, no official titles. But something about the way he spoke, the way he'd named the exact amount of money and property, it felt too familiar. So she dug deeper. It took her 4 hours, 3 cups of coffee, and one friend from college who now worked in corporate compliance to find the connection. Her father, Richard Walker, wasn't listed under Ironstone, but he was a listed investor in a holding firm called Bluegate Equities. And Bluegate owned just under 8% of Ironstone's parent company. There it was, not in bold print, but undeniable. He was a stakeholder. He didn't cause the fire. He hadn't ordered it. But he had money riding on the demolition, on the luxury condos that would rise from the ash. And he'd known. At the very least, he'd known about the acquisition, about Ironstone's methods. He hadn't come to protect her. He'd come to protect his investment. Grace sat back in her chair, stunned. The realisation didn't come with fire. It came with frost, a chill that settled deep inside, curling around her lungs. Her father, her own blood, had stood by as she lost everything. And now that she was becoming a problem, he wanted her silenced, bought out, neutralised. Her mother's silence, the psychiatric reports, the sudden visit, it all fit. The picture wasn't blurry anymore. It was crystal clear. They hadn't just abandoned her, they'd used her. She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing furiously. Bullet points, timelines, names, affiliations. Leo would need all of it. This wasn't just about Ironstone anymore. This was about the people enabling them. The ones laundering the consequences of unethical development through polite dinners and estate planning. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't even try. By morning, her decision was final. She wasn't just going to expose Ironstone. She was going to expose the system that made them possible, including the man who had once promised to protect her from the world, her father. The next time they met, it wouldn't be across a table in a diner. It would be in public, in front of cameras, with facts. He had taught her everything about strategic silence. Now she would teach him about the power of truth. The idea came to Grace as she sifted through the wreckage, burned photo frames, blackened doorknobs, bits of melted wiring and scorched plaster. It hit her like a flashbulb. What if this ruin, this destruction they thought would silence her, became her loudest scream? She pitched it to Leo over takeout and whiteboard sketches, an immersive art installation, not just paintings, not metaphors, a reconstruction using the actual remains of the fire. She would name it The Fire They Lit. Leo leaned back, sceptical. You want to put ashes and rubble in a gallery? I want to tell the story they're trying to bury. Not just mine, everyone's. Walter, Tasha, the Patels, even the silence of people like my mother, people who knew and did nothing. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, It'll piss off a lot of people. Grace smiled for the first time in days. Good. They secured a warehouse space downtown, a friend of Sophia's who believed in protest art. Grace worked around the clock. She reconstructed doorways with burned planks, framed soot-stained wallpaper, suspended cracked light fixtures from the ceiling like chandeliers from a crumbling palace. In the centre of it all, she mounted her largest piece, a room-sized sculpture called Mother's Silence, a burned chair facing a mirror covered in soot, with an audio loop playing nothing but a ticking clock. "It's chilling," Leo whispered the first time he saw it. "Personal," Grace nodded. "It's the one thing she gave me that stuck." Word spread fast. Local papers picked up the buzz. Online forums debated whether it was art or exploitation. Grace didn't care. She didn't want applause. She wanted attention and accountability. The week before the opening, she sent out formal invites. One went to a reporter from The Times, another to the City Council's housing chair, and 2 envelopes, handwritten, went to the address she hadn't touched in years, Richard and Eleanor Walker, Upper East Side, Manhattan. She didn't expect them to come, but that wasn't the point. The point was they couldn't say they hadn't been invited. Opening night arrived on a Friday, drenched in drizzle. The street outside was packed. People came with umbrellas, reporters came with cameras, and the displaced tenants came carrying their memories. Inside, the air was electric. Grace moved between installations, greeting people, answering questions. Some cried openly. Others walked in silence, hands clasped tightly behind their backs. She noticed Tasha standing in front of a burned oven door, mounted on the wall, whispering something under her breath, maybe a goodbye. Then just past 8 p.m, she saw her, Eleanor Walker, standing alone near the entrance. Her hair was pulled into a tight knot. She wore a beige trench coat, sensible heels, no jewellery. Grace didn't approach her. She watched from a distance as her mother wandered slowly, eyes taking in every detail. And then she reached Mother's Silence. Eleanor stared at the soot-covered mirror, at the empty chair. The ticking clock echoed softly. She stood still for a long time. Then quietly, her shoulders began to shake. She covered her mouth with one hand. Her other hand reached out, but didn't touch the piece. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She turned and slipped out without a word. Grace didn't follow. She didn't need to. Her mother had heard her, and this time she hadn't looked away. 3 days after the opening, Grace received an envelope from a downtown law firm, stamped, sealed and formal. Inside, a cease and desist order and a lawsuit filed by Richard Walker claiming defamation of character, emotional distress and intentional misrepresentation of private family matters for public spectacle. Attached were highlighted excerpts from her exhibition catalogue, photos of the Mother's Silence installation, and statements pulled from media interviews. Her own father, the man who once threatened to cut her off for choosing art, now wanted to drag her through court for exposing the consequences of his silence. Grace stared at the papers, barely blinking. She wasn't even surprised anymore. Disappointed, yes. Devastated? Absolutely. But surprised? No. She had learned too well what power looked like when it felt threatened. Still, this wasn't just power, this was war. She called Leo, who cursed so loud into the phone she had to pull it away. Then Sophia, who offered legal contacts and emotional backup. But the most unexpected help came that evening, in the form of an email from someone she didn't know. Subject: I knew your mother before she was a walker. The message was from a woman named Margot Reeves, a retired housing activist who had once worked with Eleanor during her teaching days. They had organised protests against housing discrimination in the 80s, spoken on women's rights panels, even co-authored a short essay on educational equity. Before Eleanor married Richard, the message said, she was fire. You would have liked her. Grace agreed to meet Margot the next afternoon in a quiet cafe in Queens. The woman who greeted her wore a turquoise scarf and moved like someone who had lived through a dozen revolutions and was still willing to fight another. She didn't always agree with him, Margot said after they sat. Your mother, not even close. But Richard, he's not a man who allows disagreement for long. Grace sipped her tea in silence. She loved your art, Margot added. Showed me your early sketches once, years ago. Said she didn't understand it, but she could feel it. That's rare for someone like her. Then why did she stay silent? Grace asked, her voice low. Why let him do all this? To me? To everyone? Margot sighed. Because silence is easier to live with than exile. And your father made it clear. Any dissent would mean losing everything. The house, the name, the life. Grace looked away, throat tightening. The betrayal wasn't just that her mother hadn't defended her. It was that she had chosen comfort over truth, that she had watched her daughter be cast out and still stayed seated at the family table. She tried once, Margot continued, years ago, sent me a draft of a letter she wanted to publish, about Ironstone's tactics. I never saw it again. I think he found it. Grace shook her head. So she gave up. No, Margot said gently. She survived, that's different. And survival, well, sometimes it requires silence, but I think she's finally done being quiet. That night, Grace returned to her studio feeling heavier than ever. She didn't cry. There was a limit to how many tears one person could shed for the same wound. She opened her email to a blinking notification from an encrypted sender. No name, no subject line, just a timestamp. Attached, a single PDF file. She hesitated, then opened it. It was a scanned letter handwritten, recognisably her mother's cursive, and a zip folder labelled Ironstone Communications. She clicked through. Dozens of email chains between Ironstone executives, memos about accelerated clearance procedures, meeting minutes referencing low-risk fire scenarios, and most damning, an internal summary of known shareholders advised to expect a spike in property value following expected incident resolution at site hash 147B. Her building. Richard Walker was listed as a Class C stakeholder, and Eleanor Walker. Her name appeared once. A note, secondary contact marked uncooperative. Grace sat frozen. Her mother hadn't just stepped aside, she had been watched, flagged, silenced. Until now. This wasn't just evidence, it was a confession. Grace forwarded everything to Leo, then closed her laptop and sat in the dark. Her mother had spoken, at last. By morning, Grace had sent the files to Leo, her attorney, the district attorney's office, and 2 investigative journalists. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for advice. The time for waiting was over. She walked into the DA's office herself at 9:01 a.m, holding a printed binder of everything her mother had anonymously sent. The receptionist gave her a startled look as she said, "I have new evidence for the Bedford Avenue fire. It's urgent." An hour later, she sat in a small windowless conference room with an assistant district attorney and 2 investigators. They flipped through the pages slowly, eyes narrowing at each mention of accelerated vacancy, expected incidents, and internal risk assessments marked as externally untraceable. "This is substantial," one of them muttered. "Where did you get this?" Grace hesitated. "From someone who's been silent too long." They didn't press. Instead, they asked questions, took notes, and promised to reopen the investigation. This time, not just into the fire, but into Ironstone itself. When she stepped back out into the morning sun, Grace felt lightheaded. Not relieved, there was still too much ahead, but awake, alive. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't reacting, she was driving, and the world was beginning to listen. The next article came from the Village Voice, then a segment on NPR. A photo from her exhibit, Walter standing beside a charred record player, made the front page of an arts magazine with the headline, "Art That Demands Justice." Social media lit up, people shared stories, hashtags spread, #fire. They lit, #ashes, speak, #displaced not silent. Gallery owners from Chicago and LA reached out, asking to host the exhibit. A senator tweeted about creative resistance exposing corporate rot. The New York Times published a full-length feature titled Grace Walker and the Art of Unbuilding. Grace didn't crave fame, but she welcomed the amplification. The louder her story got, the harder it became to ignore. But then Leo called with a tone she hadn't heard before, tight, clipped, urgent. "We've got a problem," he said. She met him at the gallery, where he sat with his laptop open to a profile of a man named Gregory Halverson, a long-standing member of the City Zoning Commission. Grey hair, perfect teeth, a history of the approving permits that raised eyebrows but never consequences. "What am I looking at?" Grace asked. Leo scrolled. "He's one of the senior officials who signed off on Ironstone's redevelopment request after the fire, the one that went through in just 6 days. Grace raised her eyebrows. "And?" Leo clicked again, pulling up a wedding photo. Grace's parents, smiling in formal wear, with another couple beside them. "That's him?" Leo said, pointing. Your father's best friend since Yale. They were roommates. He's your godfather, Grace. She stared. No, she whispered. But there was no denying it. She remembered the man vaguely. Holidays, barbecues, quiet conversations with her father behind closed doors. Your dad didn't just own a stake, Leo said. He had an insider in the system. It all clicked. The fast permits, the silence, the smug confidence during their last conversation. He hadn't just tried to buy her off. He'd built a firewall around himself, with friends in high places. Grace sat down slowly, breath catching in her throat. How deep does this go? She asked. I don't know yet, Leo said. But if Halverson's involved, it's more than corporate corruption. It's government collusion. Grace's fingers clenched into fists. They didn't just burn her building. They had stacked the matches, paid off the inspectors, and fast-tracked the cleanup. Her story wasn't isolated, it was systemic. That night, Grace stood alone in her studio, surrounded by ashes she had turned into testimony. She stared at the sculpture of a door frame half consumed by fire. She had kept it unpainted, raw, jagged, authentic. It reminded her of the first night she returned to her ruined apartment, the smell, the silence, the crushing weight of loss. Now she understood what she was truly fighting, not just Ironstone, not just her father, but the entire network that made injustice look like bureaucracy. She didn't feel scared, she felt ready. The next threat came not in words, but in flames. Grace returned to her sublet late one evening to find the hallway filled with smoke. Her door was blackened, partially burned, the lock warped, and a small fire had scorched the base as if someone had tried to torch it but ran out of time or nerve. The fire department confirmed the source. An accelerant had been poured along the bottom of the door and ignited. Her neighbour's quick response with a fire extinguisher had stopped it from spreading. Grace stood in the middle of her apartment, shaking. It wasn't just a message, it was a warning. They knew where she lived. And this time, they didn't want her silenced legally. They wanted her scared. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She packed a bag and left before the walls could breathe in another layer of fear. The next morning, she found Leo pacing in front of the gallery, his phone to his ear and rage in his voice. They told me I was jeopardising the paper's neutrality, he said, as he clicked off the call. Translation, stop digging or you're done. Grace stared at him. They're threatening your job. He nodded, jaw tight. Apparently, targeting city officials could be considered a conflict of interest, especially when one of them is married to our publisher's sister. Her eyes darkened. You're kidding. I wish I was. Grace clenched her fists. They're trying to cut off every path. They're underestimating you, Leo said, and me. She met his gaze. Then let's give them something to really fear. 3 days later, Grace stood behind a podium in front of the city courthouse. News crews crowded the steps. Former tenants stood behind her, some holding signs, others holding fragments of burned memories, melted doorknobs, charred photos, splintered beams. She wore black, not for mourning, but for battle. This is not just about one fire, she said, voice steady through the microphones. This is about a system built to displace, to erase, and to profit off destruction. She lifted a folder, copies of the same documents she'd given to the DA. These are internal communications from Ironstone, proving not only premeditated risk, but cooperation from public officials. Then she paused. My name is Grace Walker. My father, Richard Walker, is a financial stakeholder in Ironstone's parent company. He is also a personal friend and long-time associate of Gregory Halverson, head of the City Zoning Commission. Their ties go back decades, and they have used that connection to facilitate the illegal clearance of rent-controlled housing. Gasps rose from the crowd. Camera shutters clicked like gunfire. I am not speaking out for revenge, Grace continued. I am speaking because people like Walter, like Tasha, like the Patel family, like hundreds of others, have been erased in silence for too long, and that ends today. She stepped back, hands steady, heart pounding. No one stopped her, yet. That evening, Grace received a call from an unknown number. She answered, expecting another threat. Instead, a woman's voice, shaky but determined. I saw your press conference, the woman said. I lived in an ironstone-owned building in the Bronx. It burned down 5 years ago. Grace's pulse quickened. What's your name? Carmen. I didn't say anything back then. I had kids, no money, no help. But now, her voice cracked. There was a man I met once, said he was consulting with the developers, financial side. He looked familiar. I saw his picture in the article about your father. Grace sat down slowly. Are you sure? I remember him, Carmen said. He smiled the whole time, said the fire was a tragic reset. I never forgot those words. After they hung up, Grace stared at the wall, numb. This wasn't his first time. Her father hadn't just enabled a corrupt system. He'd been part of its blueprint. And now survivors were beginning to remember, to speak, to rise. Ashes, after all, don't fade. They settle and they wait. The courtroom was packed. Press badges dangled from lanyards, notebooks filled laps, and cameras waited for the first gavel to drop. Grace sat in the front row, flanked by Leo and 2 former tenants, Walter and Carmen. Her palms were damp, her spine stiff, but her eyes were locked on the name above the docket. State of New York versus Ironstone Holdings, Inc. After months of gathering evidence, witness statements, leaked communications, and mounting pressure from the public, the DA had filed a formal criminal case. Charges included conspiracy to commit arson, endangerment, fraudulent acquisition of property, and tenant harassment on a mass scale. The city buzzed like it hadn't in years. The headlines were relentless. Tenant turned whistleblower faces off against developers. Ashes speak, Grace Walker's fight ignites national reckoning. Fire as a business model, DA targets Ironstone in landmark case. Grace's name was no longer buried beneath gallery captions. She had become a symbol, a reluctant one maybe, but a powerful one nonetheless. Inside the courtroom, the Ironstone legal team sat like a wall of polished stone, suits tailored, faces blank, eyes cold. But cracks were forming. Several executives had already resigned. Investors were pulling out, and documents continued to surface, some leaked by internal employees who claimed they couldn't live with the guilt anymore. When the prosecution began laying out its case, Grace felt a knot untangle in her chest. Not because it was over, but because someone finally said out loud what they had all whispered in fear for so long. This was not an accident. This was a strategy. Outside crowds gathered. Some held candles for those displaced. Others carried signs. Homes, not profits. We won't burn quietly. Grace is our voice. Her phone buzzed mid-trial. A news alert. Breaking, Richard Walker resigns from Ironstone-linked holdings firm amid public scrutiny. Grace stared at the screen. Her father hadn't called. He hadn't released a statement. But the board minutes were public now. He was out. Later that evening, a press release surfaced, sanitised, cold. Mr. Walker has chosen to step down to allow the company to move forward without distraction. He maintains no involvement in or knowledge of the alleged criminal actions under investigation. Grace read the final sentence twice. He maintains no involvement, still denying, still distancing, as if silence could wash blood from his hands. But the system had learned from him, and now it was learning from her. The following morning, as Grace poured coffee in the gallery kitchen, Leo burst through the door, nearly breathless. You need to see this, he said, tossing a legal memo onto the table. She scanned the heading, Amended Motion for Investigation, State v. Richard Walker. Below it, a summary of new charges under review: complicity in fraud, negligent oversight, collusion with public officials, and suppression of internal whistleblowers. Her breath caught. You're saying they're officially investigating him now, not just the company, him. Leo sat down across from her, voice softer now. They don't open cases like this without intent. There's enough to warrant a full inquiry. If the investigators find confirmation of involvement in the Bronx case too. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Grace looked out the gallery window, the city bustling as always. But something felt different now. This wasn't vengeance, this was justice unfolding, and slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Her father had built his legacy on untouchable distance. Now that wall was cracking, and through those cracks, truth was pouring in like sunlight. 1 year later, the sun rose over a different kind of skyline in Brooklyn, where a burned-out building once stood, charred bricks, shattered windows, and a silence thick with loss, now rose a new structure of clean lines, colourful murals, and open walkways. The community had named it Ash Haven, not as a memorial, as a beginning. Funded by a combination of lawsuit settlements, public grants, and private donations, Ash Haven was designed by the community it had once displaced. Grace had insisted on it, no outside architect imposing sterile luxury. Instead, the tenants, artists, teachers, and families who once shared hallways and soup recipes decided every detail. The murals were painted by local kids. The hallways bore plaques honouring residents who had lost everything. And in the centre of the courtyard stood a bronze sculpture, a twisted, half-melted fire escape, engraved with the words, "We were not erased." Grace stood beside the sculpture during the opening ceremony, watching people move in and out of their new homes. The Patel family now ran a small grocery store on the ground floor, freshly painted with vines and abstract flames. Walter, though slower with age, had helped set up a music room on the third floor, acoustics designed for jazz. Ash Haven wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Leo stepped beside her, holding 2 coffees. "They made it, Grace." She took a cup, nodded. "No, we did." Her father had avoided prison, barely. The court ruled in favour of a suspended sentence, citing his cooperation and age. He had lost his board seats, most of his wealth, and what little remained of his reputation. His name was now a cautionary tale in business schools and city ethics courses. Her mother had divorced him quietly and moved to upstate New York. A letter had arrived 3 months ago, handwritten, folded neatly, no return address. Grace had read it once. Eleanor had written of regret, of cowardice masked as duty, of fear dressed as loyalty. She said she had watched her daughter become what she herself had once dreamed of being, unafraid. At the end of the letter was a simple apology. "I wish I'd spoken up sooner. I'm so sorry for the fire I didn't start, but never tried to put out." Grace hadn't replied. Not because she was angry, not even because she was indifferent, but because some silences needed space before they could become dialogue. That evening, Grace stood in the middle of her latest exhibition. It was called Residue. The pieces were softer this time, not because her pain had vanished, but because she had learned how to hold it without being consumed. At the far end of the gallery was the centrepiece, a canvas that seemed to flicker under the light, layers of ash and pigment blending into a chaotic harmony. Embedded in it were fragments of her old apartment key, a burned corner of the psychiatric file her parents once used against her, and pieces of soot-covered glass from her window. It wasn't rage anymore, it was reclamation. A young woman stepped up beside her, whispering, "That one. It made me cry." Grace smiled gently. "That's okay. Ashes are heavy, but they can also plant things." The girl looked confused. But Grace didn't explain. Instead, she moved to the far wall, where a quote was printed beneath her artist's statement. "They lit the fire. I chose what to do with the ashes." And below that, in smaller text, "Family isn't where you come from. It's where you're not set on fire."